Hello, my name is Pat Fagan. I'm the director of the Marriage and Religion Research Institute, and today we're going to review a PowerPoint that captures the work of many months as I have tried to come to grips with how we move forward, both in this country and in many others, almost all others, in rebuilding the family, given the erosion of culture and given all of the other difficulties it faces. This is the framework for our future work, the way we will gather and focus on research, the way we will help parents and hopefully governments, schools, universities, reframing the orientation. In other words, the map that we want to follow to rebuild culture, to rebuild family, to rebuild communities, to rebuild nations, because they are eroding. Europe, most patently and most obviously, is disappearing, mainly through depopulation. And strange and awful to say, aided and abetted by many of those who are most endowed, most gifted, most wealthy. We now have across the globe a Malthusian orientation towards people, resources, and especially towards children and the elderly. So there's plenty of work to be done. The great news is that those who raise children according to natural law and in the practice of worshiping the Creator, for there's no one who is able to keep his own existence in existence. The need for the Creator is patent, obvious, and common sense, and actually universal in all cultures, except the eroding culture of today. So let's move forward now. This PowerPoint will probably be revised based on feedback. So there will be a number of iterations of it coming in the future. But this is the first, and hopefully it is helpful to you. It has been helpful to me to come to grips with these different elements and the foundations of how to move forward. From here, I'm going to drop up into a corner and I will be leading you through the PowerPoint. Bear with me a second as I share this screen. Okay, this is for the child, the future of the family and of humanity. And it will be about building a natural law infraculture, one that is shared by all religions. And in this presentation, we'll cover the four foundational pillars on which to build: the right of the child to the marriage of his parents, conscience, from networks to community, and the imagination harnessed, with, of course, a backdrop of culture. And let's move into culture. With cultures in disarray, it's time to rebuild a culture of belonging in marriage and in the family. Now, culture, in my view, is a people's way of relating to each other in the important tasks of life. Normally centuries in the making, cultures yield relatively successful scripts that are learned through family and community osmosis. These are scripts of how to treat each other in the important tasks of life. During all of history, much of the heavy lifting of parenting, of how to be a family, how to be married, how to be a community, was taken care of by these centuries-smoothed scripts and traditions. A reminder, the lifelong monogamous marriage that protected the child was the cultural gift of Christianity to the West, and for over a millennium was the source of the West's ever-growing human capital. This is no more. In all the developed nations, cultures have been evaporating and are now feeble or absent. And therefore, today, parents must do all the heavy lifting on their own without the help of culture, of raising their children. But it is easier if this is done with friends whom they trust. Let's just look at multiple factors eroding culture. Some people, particularly conservatives, are inclined to zero in just on one major factor, normally Marxism or materialism or something, but there are many other elements. Fallen human nature is the most primary one. This tendency to choose evil because of its alluring, seemingly benefits. Machiavelli, let's jump forward. I'm going to start around the year 1500. Machiavelli was the beginning of the erosion of the Christian culture in a significant way because he was putting obstacles, major obstacles, dysfunctions between the ruler and the ruled, thus massively corrupting the polis, the way we live as a community, as a polity. Tyrannies are always disruptive of cultures. I'm Irish, grew up in Ireland, so you'll forgive this, but one of the first, a lot of people will not agree with me on this, but bear with me, I'm Irish and have experience of the fruits of this. I think the first major tyrant, very deliberately undermining culture, was Queen Elizabeth I. Many English people regard her, in many ways rightfully, as a great queen, but for those for whom she was a tyrant, and there are many, we have different things. But there are many other tyrants. I just think of her. French Revolution produced its every major nation in the world has had tyrants. Normally coming from the corruption of a good before that. Fast forward to today, corporate woke initiatives are undermining culture, even undermining cognitions and relationships between people. There were, in the 60s, the deliberate radical revolt of the radical feminists. On another way of thinking, actually, mass migrations have always disrupted cultures. The Vandals, the Huns, and the Visigoths was a massive disruption of Roman Latin, Greco-Roman Latin culture across southern Celtic Europe. And today, the mass migrations of populations are, just by their very nature, disruptive of cultures. Sweden comes to mind immediately, but many others. Back in the 70s, 60s, the beginning of the Industrial Revolution disrupted culture, the culture of the home, of the workplace, of the intimate relationship between home and workplace. Fast forward to the 1960s, the pill changed the sexual mores and practices of nations to the disruption of marriage, family, and even birth. Aspects of the internet. The internet gives us many goods, but very disruptive in many other ways. Malthus coming along in 1798 was a massive disruption, the seed from which the anti-population movement of the present, mainly using abortion and contraceptives, which really undermined marriage, family, and intimate relationships between husbands and wives, fathers and mothers, and children. Socialist materialism, the materialism itself. Aspects of television started in the 1950s. Great benefits. We all enjoy television, but a number of disruptions of family life, of intimacy, driving out actually a lot of conversation, and so on. Aspects of the arts, almost always artists, actors tempted to push the boundaries of what's acceptable, particularly in the sexualized. Rise of contraception, I'm not talking about the pill here, but actually the practice of contraception was massively disruptive. starting in the 1930s in a big way, but it had really begun back in the 1700s, accelerated through the 18, and then really took off after Lambeth in 1930. Medical technologies, bringing great goods, but also rather disruptive, as we can see with euthanasia, with abortion, and with many other applications of medicine that violate natural law. Libertarian materialism, which is the flip side of socialist materialism. Socialist materialism tends to come with tyranny. Libertarian materialism tends to come with license, both undermining sexual relationships in particular. Drug trade, we saw it in Britain and the opium wars, opium trade, disrupting communities, ways of life, polity, the whole lot in southern China back in the 1800s. Today, narco-terrorism, drug trade, massively disrupting Central South America and North America, and political systems as well. Transportation, the train, the automobile, the airplane, great goods, but also very disruptive, very dispersing of families, which weakens the relationships and the sense of belonging and the embeddedness of people in each other. The welfare state, income without work of 1964, massively disruptive of the poor family in the inner city, where today we now have 3-4 generations of fatherless families, and with boys increasingly bereft of human capital. No-fault divorce is another one. These are legal systems that have disrupted patterns. Our Supreme Court has on many occasions disrupted family and sexuality patterns in the last century. There are just some examples of how culture is eroded. So the erosion of culture, the weakening of culture is most likely an ever ongoing thing. So reforms are going to be ever ongoing. I'm Catholic, and what jumps to mind here is similar things have happened with many great religious orders. Their culture gets eroded, and then there's a need for reform. Well, I think that's probably true of all of us and of nations in particular and their cultures. Some of the sexual aspects of the new cultures and subcultures that have arisen to displace the traditional culture of the West: abortion, sex slavery, pornography, cohabitation, the flaunting of gay issues, disruptive. Sex ed is very disruptive of sexuality patterns in the family. Child sexual abuse has had huge effects on family. Excuse the background noise. The videos that we see, Netflix, etc., pushing the boundaries, many disruptive and undermining of what makes for a strong family. In many cases, actually, with the new digital, what we bring into our living rooms are people and incidents that we would never let within a million miles of our front door if these people sought to enter our home. But through the digital, we invite them in, and so on. Now, let's turn now actually to one of the big issues that I see, the big pillars for rebuilding the future, and it's the cultivation of conscience. Why this? In the absence of culture, these scripts that help us relate and take care of each other in the important tasks of life, conscience, which is the intellect solving moral and relational issues, conscience becomes the default resource at the individual level. Now, there are two functions of conscience. First, the most popular, and what most people immediately think of when you say conscience, is do no evil. And conscience is like you're prompting, you're guilty here, you are guilty, that feeling of guilt is conscience in operation. On a fundamental and a very good thing, do not evil. You have to guard against these things. But there's a lot more to conscience, and I think this is relatively unexploited. And that's the second great capacity it has, conscience, the intellect in action here. it can respond and point out to the question, what is the good? What is better? And what is the best? And the good news is, I think, for this effort at rebuilding, is that the deliberate, constant formation of one's conscience to seek the best yields enormous benefits for the individual. And the more that it's practiced and taken on by parents and families and raising their kids and putting this before them, not just the do no evil, not just that, but prompting them to seek the good, the better, and even the best. Imagine a kid who by his or her teen years has caught on to this and asks that question of themselves repeatedly through the day. What's the best I could do here? Okay, the moral life, how we live in community with our fellow man, in it, the best guide is the Ten Commandments and their shorthand version, the two great loves, love God and love your neighbor. I have the Ten Commandments truncated a bit here. You got one true God, honored in name, worshipped weekly on the Sabbath. I'd underline weekly. That's what he indicated in the Ten Commandments. That's the first, and that's a positive. And the second big positive, honor your parents, honor family life. The rest of the Ten Commandments are about evils to be avoided, the floor below which one should not go. Do not kill or injure, no sex outside of your marriage, and honoring every other marriage. No stealing, no lying, no calumny, that's lies or detraction, private weaknesses or faults exposed. No envy of your neighbor's good fortune, their wealth or their spouse. So conscience, the intellect in action, is seeking the good and avoiding the evil. And for the raising of children, what we really have two things going here. The highway is really seeking the good, the better, and the best. But the guardrails are similar to what I call the floor, the negatives to be avoided. The highway is for freedom, while the guardrails are for safety. We go forward to the good, the better, and the best, while avoiding the temptations that corrupt the self and injure others. Now, in raising children, we look from the bottom up to the top here with regard to conscience. You see, conscience in the beginning, for a very young child, their intellect isn't developed, so they can't figure these things out. But immediately, the parents have to start keeping them within certain boundaries, because outside of that, they're going to harm themselves. They're going to harm their relationships with others, with other kids. If they can't play properly, they'll harm their relationship with their siblings if they do the same thing. So parents impose the guardrails, and sometimes with punishment. If we jump to the top, by the time the late teenager, now a young adult, reaches that stage, we're happy with them and they're a mature adult if they're self-maintaining their safety norms, if they're aware of the barriers, the guardrails, and honor them by not bumping up against them. Or if they do, as we all do at times and deliberately even violate, they repent, they tap in with their conscience, they acknowledge the guilt, and then they take steps to undo it, asking for forgiveness and maybe making restoration with those whom they have violated, or God, if it's a violation there, of themselves particularly. In sexual matters, shame keeps many of these things hidden. We keep them hidden, but they're there. And for Catholics, the practice of confession is a great way of reestablishing, recalibrating the conscience. Taking stock, doing what's necessary is not just telling sins to get, as it were, to get rid of it. No, it's to repent, take stock, get back on track, take care of whatever restoration is needed. So in the teen years, in that middle term, is that transition, and this is the part of the work of parents and teachers, teaching teens to take on the task of self-maintaining the guardrails, of honoring them, and of digging deep into why they are there. This leads us to issues we're going to get into now. Training the conscience for the lifelong journey of life, the climb upwards. Now, we're alone in one sense. Our conscience is ours alone. But on the journey of life, we travel best in the companionships of others, not alone, because we're made to belong. A big point to get across to teenagers about the highway and the guardrails, about the commandments in the negative and the commandments in the positive. There's total individual creative freedom to choose the pathway one likes above the floor. I use the floor here as that below which we cannot go. The negative commandments, those piled, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not injure, thou shalt not steal, lie, lust after, envy, etc. All those are below the floor. But above the floor, we're not told what to do except in those two things, those two positive commandments, honoring God and honoring your parents. Above that, everybody's totally free to choose from all the good pathways in life, all the goods, the journey they want to go. So they can be individually totally creative to their own good, their own happiness, choosing any walk they like, as long as it's above the floor. That bottom picture there is like the going into the cave, going below ground, avoiding the chaos of license. Actually, that's what it really is. The violation of the commandments, going below the floor, is choosing evil for its alluring temptations, but it always causes chaos, undermines ourselves and our own capacities, and most frequently also injures others at the same time. Now, getting there, actually, one of the big things I think to be developed in the future in human nature, and educational systems are only beginning to tap into this, and that's the imagination, which is a huge booster of the capacities of the will and the capacities of the intellect. And applied here on the good that is possible, the things that beckon. You can have the young boy, the teenager, beginning to map out, to dream of the ways in life that he or she would like to traverse, and harnessing their imagination, harnessing their heroes to walk that way with them. Their heroes can be any of the great heroes in history. The heroes also could be God himself. And in their imagination, walking these pathways over the decades, or walking the pathway of the next hour, or this day, or this coming week, in their imagination, harnessing that pathway. And because having trod that way in their imagination, it becomes much, much easier for them to do it in reality. Going on now to one of the other foundational pillars of a culture of belonging that we need for the future, for the raising of children. And that is actually, I think, a rival to the right to life of the child is the right of the child to the marriage of his biological parents. And I think operationally very powerful when part of a culture avoids many difficulties, avoids the difficulty of abortion. When, as a people, and starting in the family, parents with their child, with their children, getting across the right of every child, the right of every infant, the right of every baby, even those in the womb, especially those in the womb, to the marriage of both his biological parents, or both her biological parents. Because without it, the child, the boy or the girl, won't achieve their potential, or putting it in the positive, because with the marriage, they have much greater chance of arriving at the potential they're endowed with. The child did not ask to come into existence. His parents, his biological parents, brought him into existence without him asking for it. He is totally dependent on them. They owe him their dedication to him or to her for all of his growing and her growing years. There is no child ever in existence who could not look both his parents in the eye and say, "You owed me your marriage." Or any fetus in the womb being able to speak to mom and dad would say, "You owe me your marriage. Without it, I cannot become the person I am meant to be. I cannot develop those things you've already endowed me with through the shared DNA of both of you." So this central assumption on which depends the future peace of the world and the individual's own moral orientation, and in which the future of mankind will be shaped by the men and women who built their sexuality and their families around this universal, inalienable right of the child to the marriage of his biological parents. This is the only understanding of sexuality that works for the good of all, for the child, for the father, and for the mother. This holds across all times and all peoples. Built around that, accompanying that, at the heart of that, is the pivotal event in all cultures. And it's that strategic goal of parents, which is to prepare each child for a good marriage to a good spouse. You could say that's the focal point of marriage and family, is the preparation and then the follow-through of a good marriage. Because the natural family of father, mother, and child is the foundation of all natural goods. It is the foundation of a universal, global, natural laws where infraculture, on which all other specific cultures can be and will be built. This underlies them all. And in the moral universe, that universe of how we treat each other, how we relate to each other, and how we treat God and relate with God, marriage is the pivotal point, because it is the sexual properly harnessed. It's the pivotal point not only on the sexual, but on so many other practical things: budgeting, productivity, foresight, education, marketplace, savings, growing old. Everything in a well-functioning society depends on and emanates from the marriage of a man and woman. And at the core of that is the right of the child to the marriage of his parents. This is so violated now, but one good that can come out of the violation is the beginning of the articulation of this right and the dissemination of this in discussions from high to low, from the family dinner table all the way to UN resolutions, through Congress, through the British Parliament, through all parliaments around the world, to all executives, to all bureaucrats, particularly those in the whole social policy area. This is the fundamental guiding pillar, guiding principle, the right of the child to the marriage of his parents. There are times when that cannot be delivered. For instance, when a married man who already has children has sex outside of marriage with another woman and a baby is produced, well, there's a conflict here and he can't deliver marriage to both. So the child's right is violated. That man, that woman, and the community owe that child a lot to make up for that. All of this then emanates out into the need to belong. The need to belong is the most fundamental human need of all, bar none. And I think I can say bar none because on your deathbed, most of us are going to be hoping that on the other side of where we're going, we will belong to others, and others will belong to us. If we feel that's the case, we do not fear death. If we don't think that's the case, we will fear death. So there's an order to belonging to each other. The infant first belongs with his mother, and the mother always belongs with her husband, and he with her and their children. And the children belong with their parents and with each other. All this belonging within the family, within the marriage of the family, all becoming a we, a unit, a unity, a very self-conscious unity, a self-conscious we with the confidence in their family's way of life. Every family has slightly different ways of relating, and they develop their own great ways. That will happen with great confidence if mom and dad belong to each other closely, because the other belonging all stems from that. Then the family belongs in a local community of other families, and these communities in their churches, and churches in their towns, and towns in their states, or in Canada in their provinces, or in other parts of the world in their regions. We all identify with those. We feel we belong there. The state in its nation, and the nation in its region and in the world community. As this is recorded, we've just finished the World Cup, and it is a great sport where we can see the whole world enjoying a certain belonging with each other, in enjoying this sport, and even rejoicing in the country that wins. Okay, when this nested belonging is present at all levels, which has never happened completely in human history. Some cultures and some nations achieve more of it than others. But the more it has happened, the more all thrive. And the linchpins to this are the two great loves, the two great belongings: lifelong marriage of the parents and the weekly worship of God. This need to belong ought to animate all international bodies. As the globe becomes smaller, it is critical that these two forms of belonging become central in the debates, or assumed, not that they will be debating them, but they just assume them and make sure these assumptions are within all the proposals that come forward at the United Nations, UNESCO, the World Health Organization, and the World Bank. There's a lot of work to be done to pull that off. But if it's never begun, we'll never arrive there. And there are many good people in all of these institutions, maybe not enough, but there are many great people there who will agree with this and work with this. Now, this belonging, the two great belongings in marriage and in worship, has huge human capital effects. And as I alluded to back in the map of Europe and the expansion of Christianity, these two practices, these two principles and practices of worship and of marriage, so the present day social science data shows how powerful they are in forming and growing human capital. And actually, one of the things, the stupid things, I think, that our leaders and our academics are not drawing attention to, as marriage breaks down and as worship diminishes, the human capital of every country where that's happening is decreasing, generation to generation. Let's have a look at some of the things. It's very clear from the US federal data, as we have repeatedly gone into many times in MARRI research. This is verifiable in the US federal survey system, which illustrates the facts about the creation and the way that God made man to thrive. You can look at these. We've got over 130 outcomes from all federal surveys. There are 7 or 8 major ones. 130 outcomes traversing all the big tests in life. And you can see them at marri.us/mapping America. Getting the sexual right is foundational to all other operations in society, from an intimate couple all the way to the UN and the World Bank. It is the two great loves, the love of neighbor, spouse and children, and the love of God, which are the demonstrable source of the energy which makes all these institutions functional and more functional. Now, this rather abstract and philosophical claims are very visible in the US federal surveys, as I just said. And they consistently illustrate the effect of these two great loves. Adults and kids as a group who are married in an always intact married family do better than any other group. Those who worship weekly as a group do better than any other group. And when you combine the both, well, you've seen some of the outcomes. You'll see them even in such intimate micro-operations as a couple's enjoyment of sexual intimacy. Here we have this from a federal data source. Those who enjoy the marital embrace the most are the always intact married family that worships God weekly. If you look there at the lesser blue, that's the always intact family, but that does not worship. And then that smallest red at the back is the poor broken family that doesn't worship at all. It does lowest on every outcome. And the always intact married family that worships weekly does best on every outcome. And the other two go back and forth. But also, all the other outcomes, the same thing happens. And here we're looking at one of the most powerful ones, one of the most issues of greatest concern for every government across the world. Is highly invested in the education of its growing children and teenagers. And here we find that marriage and religion, the weekly worship of God, deliver massively what governments strive to do, spend billions, even trillions, trying to affect, and yet they neglect both of these in education policy. It's not talked about, but it's powerfully present and verifiable. This is a large part of the work to be done. Now, these two very different sexualities, the one of the always intact married family centered around the rights of the child, preparing the child for marriage so that the child in turn can repeat the same in his or her time. This yields two very different societies. And the thriving society, the thriving model, is the belonging through the two great loves, belonging in marriage, which will yield more worship. The more populations worship, the more they marry, and the more they have children, the more all relationships and all outcomes in that society get better and better, stronger and stronger. The failing model is the rejection of the two great loves, less worship of God, less marriage, and fewer children. And this, by the way, is the model of all the OECD countries, of the UN, of UNESCO, of the World Bank. And then you say, well, how come that, we're getting richer and things seem to be getting better? Well, on the material end, technology and science is delivering massive productivity and wealth. But on the relational side, we all know things are falling apart. And this is what we're talking about. This is what society is. Society is how people relate to each other. And in a good society, they relate well at all the levels, from the intimate of marriage and family, all the way up through local community, going to the local store, going to the local bank, on up through regional, and as you get into government and big firms, people relate well to each other by observing the two great loves. That is happening less and less, and we all know it. So there is huge work to be done. Necessary work, absolutely necessary if the world is to function well again. So the implications are world building, if we build around the child, or world weakening, which happens with all the non-child-centered sexualities. So the formation of the future thriving citizen, the child, needs local communities of families, because, as we said earlier, this heavy lifting is easier if done with others. So communities of families that honor and serve their child their children, even before conception. Honoring the child before conception shapes the sexuality of the unmarried, where they focus on the other, not on themselves. And then within marriage, actually, they have the greatest enjoyment of the sexual. So they win on both ends. So how do we get from networks, from the family to networks to community? It's essentially by asking, by identifying, and by forming local little mini networks. Every man is his castle and his castle. Every husband and wife, the castles there, they're rather grand, but every person's home is their castle. But we do all this networking essentially to surround the children with a great environment and others who relate to them in the way we want them eventually to relate to others. Fathers need to identify other fathers who think similarly and invite them to join fathers who think that way. And then as the network expands, invite other families in who are taking on and are willing and already abide by the principles of the two great loves. So from such a local little mini network, say I picture here like a dome over the family, a protective dome over the network, protecting by their relating with each other, and that gradually expanding. That's the model for the future. This is how everything has grown in the past. This natural law infrastructure actually abides in every religion. It's natural for people to be closer to people out there saying of similar religion, of similar view in life. That's a human nature thing. But it is good for people of different religions to very deliberately relate with each other around these issues. I know most people won't want their children marrying outside their religion. And if they're in close contact, that possibility, of course, increases because sexual attraction is massively powerful. But leave that aside. Every religion, every religious community that abides by the principles of the Ten Commandments, the two great loves, needs the support of each other. As we make the case at different levels of government, at different levels of corporate and marketplace work, of the need for freedom, the right to freedom, to do the good of raising our children, to belong in their family and to belong to their sexual partners in the future so that they can take care of their children in a lifelong marriage. Now, how MARRI will serve you, all this reorientation and laying out this way of seeing the future will have its impact on MARRI, because you husbands and wives will do the heavy lifting, but we will lighten the load by providing support for networks of families and helping men and women to build out such networks. It's not a membership or anything like that, but people need and constantly need to be encouraged to build their own little mini local networks that are natural human relationships of friendships between families, and expanding that, because a family alone is a family in danger. We'll also provide more and more practical helps, tapping into where we judge the best work is being done around the world, available through the internet on all sorts of needs: parenting well, communicating well, growing key relationships, knowing what to do at your different stages of your child's growth. We will supplement wherever we think it is necessary with courses, most likely mini courses, that may be helpful to parents who have particular needs that seem to be unaddressed or that are not addressed fully enough. But all of this is all dedicated to forming children for their future marriage. The future of the world is essentially built on preparing the child for marriage. That's what makes the world go around. Love makes the world go around. And of course, the most exciting human love is romantic love. So the future for those of us pursuing this is a great and enjoyable future, full of love, full of romance. Vive la romance. In rebuilding this foundation, and this is the serious part, we must build a natural law infraculture shared by all religions, shared by all nations across the world, and centered around the needs of the newly conceived child, who always was and always will be the future of humanity at every stage, in every society, in all times. Thank you.